Hello, everyone, and welcome back to In Lay Terms. Today, I'm very excited to announce a very special guest, Mr. Leighton Grey. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, and I love the title of your show. I'm hoping I can live up to it, because unfortunately, like most lawyers, I tend to fall into the sort of lexicon that lawyers use. So I'm going to try and keep everything in lay terms just to honor your show.
Just imagine that the audience is almost as dim-witted as me, and try to use one or two syllable words.
All right, I'll do my best.
All right, Mr. Grey. Probably everyone in the audience knows who you are, but just for the sake of those that don't, can you give us a brief description?
Sure. I'm a lawyer practicing in Alberta. I'm also licensed to practice in British Columbia and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but I'm mainly focused in Alberta. I've been practicing law here in Alberta since 1993. I was made Queen's Counsel here in 2010, which is kind of a special honorific. It's supposed to mean that I know something about the law. May or may not be true, given the day and what I'm talking about. Hopefully, today is one of those days. And I had a very interesting experience in 2020, like many people who experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. But I experienced it differently than most, in that very early on, I was certain that something really, really awful was happening. And of course, my worst fears have been realized. And so I went through, I came out publicly in terms of writing and criticizing government. And that caused me to go through a really life-changing cancel culture experience. I was taken to task by Rachel Notley. I was forced to resign from a provincial board here in Alberta that was designed to select judges, because I would not select judges based upon diversity, inclusion, equity criteria. And so that set me on a course which was very different from what I had been doing. I'd been mostly involved as a criminal lawyer, especially defending high-level criminal cases, done month-long murder trials in front of juries and things of that nature, hundreds of sexual assault trials. And I was also very involved in Indian residential school class actions, and still am. But the COVID experience changed my practice and really changed my life, changed the trajectory of my life in a couple of important ways. I was invited by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and John Carpe to take on some high-profile cases involving pastors in Alberta, James Coates and Timothy Stevens and others. And also, I was given the opportunity to be lead counsel on a very important constitutional challenge that the major media doesn't talk about, but I think is probably one of the most important civil decisions in Alberta in this century, perhaps in this country, and that's Ingram, in which we were successful in having declared all of the lockdown orders illegal. So since then, and that set me on a journey where I began doing more cases involving vaccine mandates, fighting for the constitutional rights of Albertans and Canadians. And then the other thing that happened was I was drawn sort of accidentally into the podcasting world where you live, and I developed the Grey Matter podcast, which is well over 200 episodes and is growing. Actually, not to boast, in all humility, we were ranked number 55 by Apple Podcasts in Canada just recently, just this past week. And so my profile has become sort of national, and the podcasting experience has been just wonderful, because it's been an incredible journey of learning, meeting so many brilliant people, reading their books, talking to them, politicians, athletes, philosophers, public officials, scientists, just an incredible cavalcade of people that have come through my life because of the podcast. And then it's also led me to write my book, which I'm about to publish soon, a book of essays, which is called, not sort of tongue in cheek, a collection of gray matter. So that's what brings me to your show today, and I think that's probably why you want to talk to me, because of some of the things that I've been involved in. Not the least of which has been a focus now in constitutional law and trying to change the laws that are impacting Canadians in their daily lives. Some of which really we're discovering perhaps too late are not being applied correctly, or are being fashioned in a way that is that is anti-human flourishing, anti-freedom, anti-prosperity, and I think anti-Canadian. So that about sums me up.
It's a very impressive resume, I have to say, and I definitely have been following you for a while. I watched your show. I
Thank
agree
you.
with.
Thank you for doing that.
It's a great show, and I agree pretty much with all of your principles. So on to my first question for today. About 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, Tucker Carlson went to Alberta. After that, you were in attendance. You went on your Twitter space and you gave what I'm calling your manifesto for a public inquiry with the full backing of the law to look into the activity or possible criminal actions of the government.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that specifically the inquiry? Any province in particular where you believe it should be first unveiled, and then where it should go after that federally?
Right. So you sort of going back to the beginning, I think I'm not unique in saying this. People smarter than me are saying this, that we need a full-blown public inquiry to look into what happened in this country, and in our provinces, how the COVID-19 pandemic was experienced by Canadians. Some incredible work has already been done in this regard. The best work, really, obviously, has been done by the National Citizens Inquiry, people like Ches Crosby and Sean Buckley. I'm very privileged to have been a part of that process, both as a witness and as a lawyer who was involved in that. So we have this incredible treasure trove of evidence collected from from many people from all walks of life, some of whom sadly are no longer with us. They've passed on. So we have this repository of evidence that would be most useful in this type of public inquiry. I wrote a paper about a year and a half ago called No Amnesty Without Accountability. And what I meant, the thesis of that paper is essentially this, and this is why I think that we need a full-blown public inquiry on COVID. I don't think we can get to the point as a society, as a country, or as individuals, where we can declare a general amnesty on all the things that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, most of which actually are going to continue to affect us in almost every aspect of our lives for generations to come. I don't think we're going to be able to get there until we have a situation where we have some accountability for the decision makers, the people that I call COVID villains. So let's talk about Alberta specifically. I had the opportunity to, in the Ingram case that I mentioned earlier, to cross-examine Dr. Dina Hinshaw for 4 days. I like to think that I helped to get her fired. She deserved to be fired. She was a COVID villain. She is a COVID villain. That's one example. Jason Kenney was a COVID villain. His political career effectively ended the day that Albertans and Canadians and people around the world saw Grace Life Church in Alberta triple barricaded and turned into an RCMP barracks. Sorry, I just touched my microphone. These are examples of COVID villains. During our recent provincial election in May of 2023, many of these COVID villains were dealt with by the electorate. People like Mr. Shandro, who was our justice minister during all of this. People like Copping, who was a health minister. People like Casey Maydew, who is also a justice minister, and others. They were simply voted out of office. And these were key people in the Kenney cabinet. But my view is that this is simply not enough. We still have in our province the availability of these COVID-19 vaccines. We know how hazardous and dangerous they are. Just for example, some of your viewers and listeners might know that the Surgeon General of Florida has banned these in that state because he is aware, and it's now public knowledge, that these vaccines contain about 500 times the safe and effective dosage of mRNA for human beings. These should not be available in our province. And there's an extreme cover-up that's going on right now in terms of, the hazards of these vaccines. A person going to see their doctor anywhere in Canada, and especially in my home province of Alberta, if they ask their physician about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine, of the COVID-19 vaccine, that doctor is prohibited under penalty of loss of their medical license from telling them the truth, what everyone knows about this. The number one cause of death in Alberta, in North America, and in all of the Western world right now is something called unknown causes. Well, it's not unknown causes. These are related to the vaccines, and the vaccines are only one part of it. We had business closures, we had closures of schools, we had all kinds of harm that was caused by this, not by the COVID-19 virus, which we now know only affected a very small sampling of persons severely. And really, we always knew that. We knew that in December of 2019, before the virus even landed in North America. But what the cause of all the harm are the horrific, irresponsible, negligent, and sometimes wanton and reckless decisions made by government and public officials about how to deal with a quote-unquote pandemic health crisis. So recently, you mentioned my manifesto. Recently, I was on the Sean Newman podcast, and I mentioned this. I've been outspoken about this, and more recently, just this past week, actually last week, I was with the Premier in my home riding in Alberta, in a place called Bonnyville. And I should say that I like the Premier very much. I admire her. She's a very intelligent lady. She's got a heart as big as Alberta. She really cares about our province, and she's doing really great things. But I pressed her on this issue of the COVID-19 public inquiry, because one of the things that distinguished her from the other people who ran for the leadership of the UCP, which is essentially the premiership of Alberta, was she was very outspoken about COVID-19. You probably know she made a bold public statement that she got into some trouble for when she said that she thought that unvaccinated Canadians were essentially the most discriminated against a group of people in recent memory. And she was right. 7 million of us were vilified by our Prime Minister, and we were discriminated against in a whole number of ways, many of which are described in a class action suit that my firm is actually prosecuting right now on behalf of the unvaccinated against the Government of Canada. Anyway, I posed this question to her in private, and I'll give you the question. I'll share with you her answer. It read like this: given the recent federal court decision declaring the Trudeau government's suppression of the Freedom Convoy protest unconstitutional, the July 2023 Alberta court decision declaring the Alberta lockdown orders illegal, the strong recommendations of the Manning Panel report commissioned by your own government, the COVID motions adopted by UCP membership at the November AGM, and the compelling NCI report, will you now take the lead on public accountability and amnesty in Canada by being the first Premier to commission a full public inquiry, vested with the teeth and force of law, into the overall management and resulting societal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic? And this is what she said. At first, the response was, well, who do you want arrested? and that she was being a little bit, tongue in cheek. She wasn't being flippant. She's rarely that. But what she meant to say was things like this. Can we hold public officials accountable? Are they shrouded in some sort of immunity because they're politicians? I think people would guess what my answer to that would be. She said, would it be a waste of time and money to sort of hold individuals to account when, this is something we all experienced collectively? And she said that, and I don't fully disagree. I don't necessarily disagree with this. It is a sensible answer. She says that the better way to do it is to look sort of forward and create legislation that is going to be focused upon preventing anything like the COVID-19 pandemic from ever happening again. And to her credit, her government actually has already made some changes to the Public Health Act along that line. I didn't say this to her, but I'll say this to your viewers. I'd like them to think about the Nuremberg trials. Okay, so we've seen these. We've seen these popularized in movies. We've seen documentaries and things of that nature. And sadly, we just went through the recognition of the Holocaust remembrance in Canada and throughout the world. But lots of your viewers have seen these horrific pictures of human cadavers piled up over and over in places like Buchenwald and Auschwitz and others. But many of your listeners might not realize that those pictures were not made public until 1971. That's 26 years after the Nuremberg trials. Well, so what was the significance of the Nuremberg trials? So this is the trials of high-profile Nazis in Germany, people like Goering and and others. Well, that the significance of those trials is it recognized that those people had committed crimes against humanity, and there was public evidence brought forward. And another example would be the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel. What these did is they recognized that there is no immunity for a public official, even ones who are elected according to law, or or hold public office according to domestic law in a particular country. There's no immunity to them for committing outrageous acts of violence against the citizenry. And even though there were only a sampling of those people, of those criminals who were tried and convicted, and most of them hung, some of them sent to prison, some of them set free. Most of the Nazis, the people who were responsible for, directly or indirectly responsible for those crimes against humanity, were never put on trial. They were never convicted. Some of them were put in charge of U.S. rocket programs. but the point is, at least there was an international recognition of certain things, one of which is the doctrine of informed consent, which was very much violated during the COVID era by governments. So my point is, there was some accountability, and because we saw accountability publicly, that made the amnesty that most of the people who were responsible for these atrocious acts received. And I think we need to have the same thing with the COVID-19 public inquiry. And I don't think we're going to be able to declare an amnesty morally or legally unless and until that happens. And with just one final thought on this, if you notice in Slovakia, where there's been a regime change since the COVID-19 pandemic, they're doing just that. They're doing exactly what I urge the Premier of Alberta to do. And I'm still hopeful that this is going to happen. I think part of the problem that the Premier faces is some of the people I described as COVID villains who were part of the Kenney regime when he was in power in this province are still key figures in her government. I won't name them, but most Albertans know who I'm talking about. They're still, there still overholds from the Kenney era in her government, and so she has to be careful. And I understand why she's being, politically astute in that regard. I'm not suggesting at all that she's a coward. She certainly is not anything of the kind. But I think that may be a reason why she's hesitant to move in this direction, even though the Manning panel report really does call for a public inquiry, and the NCI report really does. And I think that this would be a very, very important thing for our country in terms of making sense of what happened to us. And I think that Canadians and Albertans really need to see that there's some level of accountability for public officials who made these disastrous decisions that really harmed us on what we're living through, the after effects, and really the early after effects, the aftershocks of the horrible decisions that they made. And it's troubling just to look at countries like Sweden that took a very different approach, and really they're doing very well. Their economy is doing very well. They don't have any of the social impacts that we have because of lockdowns. And when you look at other countries that did not impose vaccine mandates, they're not experiencing this massive wave of death that's running through Western countries. So that's why I'm so strong in my position in terms of having a full-blown COVID inquiry. But I know there are people who disagree with me, and I respect what they have to say, and I'm listening. But at this point, I'm not persuaded to step off my rock.
Good stuff. We're gonna come back to that, but could you It's my understanding that Alberta, Daniel Smith didn't just, fall from the heavens and win the race. There was a movement with Take Back Alberta that
Yes.
helped her get into power. Can
Uh,
you speak to that?
yes. Well, Take Back Alberta is a true grassroots political movement, and to understand it fully, you've got to understand the betrayal of Jason Kenney. Back in 2017, 2018, Jason Kenney got into a blue pickup truck and he put on a cowboy hat and he drove all over rural Alberta. And right on his pickup truck, it said grassroots. And he fooled a lot of people. He made them believe that he was the guy who was going to bring a grassroots political revival to Alberta. Because during that time, we were living through the Rachel Notley years when Albertans, the vast majority of Albertans, were being governed in a way which is very inconsistent with our fundamental beliefs in terms of the economy, social policy, all of it. And we're actually still living through a lot of the damage that the Rachel Notley regime caused. In fact, most recently during a cold snap, we had to borrow power from Saskatchewan because Rachel Notley had shut down, coal burning power plants that produce essential energy for Albertans to heat our homes. We live in a very cold climate, like most Canadians do. But that betrayal of Jason Kenney when he was given a massive majority by Albertans when the Unite the Right process came. That was really betrayed during the COVID-19. He did not govern as a small C conservative. In fact, when you look at the way Jason Kenney governed Alberta, it's very difficult to distinguish his process as a leader from Justin Trudeau, a very, very similar style of leadership. And this was not what Albertans wanted. And so TBA sort of arose in response to that. And this is why I mention Jason Kenney in this context. So TBA came to be in order for the specific purpose of getting rid of Jason Kenney. And some very wealthy and influential Albertans got behind Take Back Alberta. It's led by a person named David Parker, who is a very remarkable guy in terms of being able to motivate people politically, to get out of their chairs, to get out of the house and actually do things that make a difference in their communities. And that's the essence of grassroots politics, as I understand it. And this is a very deep history in Alberta, going back through Preston Manning and his father, and the social credit movement in Alberta. That's the grassroots of Alberta politics. We have a very populist political tradition in this province, and it is alive and well. And so when you look at what Take Back Alberta the way it came about, they immediately they were able to garner enough support to elect people to the board which governs the United Conservative Party. And at an AGM a couple of years ago, they were able to oust Jason Kenney. So he was removed, and in comes the leadership race and Danielle Smith. And of course, Danielle Smith has a history as the leader of the former Wild Rose Party, which was now part of the UCP through amalgamation. And she had kind of a checkered past. In 2012, she crossed the floor, and many people blamed her, I think, unfairly, for Rachel Notley's victory in 2015. But very bravely and courageously, because she had something important to do, she came and she joined the race. She had been a media personality, and and she won. She clearly was the best person for the job. I supported her. Take Back Alberta supported her, and so now she's won. And it's just incredible that the support for the United Conservative Party was down in the 20% at the time that Jason Kenney was ousted, and incredibly by May of 2023. Danielle Smith's under Danielle Smith's leadership, they were able to win a majority. Granted, a slim majority over the NDP, but it's really, really remarkable. It's one of the most remarkable stories in Canadian political history that they were able to turn that around in such a short period of time. And since then, her popularity has only risen. Take Back Alberta is very supportive of the Premier. At the last AGM in November, people supported by Take Back Alberta increase their level of support within the governing UCP board. And so really Danielle Smith has more support than ever. Her popularity is over 50%, which is approaching, Ralph Klein level numbers. That's very high for Alberta. Because even though Alberta is seen as sort of a conservative province, we also have a lot of liberal support in our province. So it's unusual for any conservative leader to get over 50. If they get into 55%, that's very high in our province, and that's where she is. Take Back Alberta supports her, and Take Back Alberta is not done. They're still involved in grassroots politics, but they are evolving more into a type of a think tank, if you will, developing ideas that make their way into policy and then into legislation. But Take Back Alberta is mostly interested in getting people out the door and getting them involved in their communities. And, I mentioned Preston Manning. He's written a series of wonderful books. My favorite of them is called Do Something. And if you read that book, basically what it sets out is 365 different things that you and I and everyone else can do every day to get involved in their communities. And Preston Manning thinks, and I interviewed him on my podcast, I had the pleasure of doing that, and I agree with him, that what has happened in our country in terms of sort of this leftist Marxist drift that we've fallen into, which is, of course, most manifested in Ottawa with this heinous liberal government, is good people have stayed home and sort of got focused on doing their jobs, working at their jobs, running their businesses, raising their kids, and they've neglected their civic responsibilities, at least the grassroots people. And so we wonder why we have things like SOGI in schools. We wonder why we have to pass legislation in Alberta that sets limits on the mutilation of children based on transgender ideology. We wonder why all of our teachers seem to think that Marxism is the best recipe for human flourishing. We wonder how this all happened. Well, the way it happened is that good people stopped getting involved in their communities. I talked about David Parker. I was at an event. He has these town hall meetings, which are nothing like Justin Trudeau's town hall meetings. But David Parker, he has this. He says this. He asked the crowd. He says, "Okay, how many of you think that some of the books in your kids' library, shouldn't be there?" And almost everyone in the room raises their hands. And then he says, "Okay, how many of you are sitting on your local library board?" No hands go up. Hence the problem. So that's what TBA is all about. It's a grassroots movement, and essentially what it's aimed at doing is getting people motivated, really inspiring them to get involved in their communities, because we still live in a great country in many ways. But one of the best things about our country, and Max Bernier talks about this, and this is why I support his party. He says, if you want to get involved in politics, it's very easy to do. You just have to get out the door and get involved. And, in many countries, you cannot do that. This is a very, very precious opportunity we have as Canadians. We really can make a difference. If my life and the things that I've done have proved anything, they've proven that. I'm just a dumb hick country lawyer. And just look at all the things that I've been able to influence in a matter of a few scant years. And of course, other people have done much more. You think of someone like a Jordan Peterson, how he's influenced many millions of lives through his brilliant books and his podcast and his work on the Daily Wire and all of his YouTube videos. I mean, he's changed people's lives for the better, and it's because he stepped outside of his safe, cloistered world. He could have stayed there. Most university professors do. And he could have lived very quietly and would have been just fine. Wouldn't have had all the hatred and vilification and the psychological college trying to take his license away. Wouldn't have had any of that. But he would have forsaken the opportunity to do all the incredible things that he's done for other people. And he was motivated and inspired to do that. And people like that inspire me, as do everyday Canadians. When I see them, when I go to TBA events and I see them, and they're just really excited to get out the door, to get together and meet with their neighbors, and and really get involved in projects that make a difference in their communities. And I think if we can all do that, that is the recipe for change in Canada and getting us back to the kind of country that I think God ordained us to be. God blessed this country so much, not just with natural resources, wealth of land, mountains, oceans, rivers, incredible diversity of people. We're so blessed. How could it be possible, conceivable, that was all done for naught, that was all meant to be destroyed? I reject that wholeheartedly. I can't believe it. And I just know that our country has a great future, but that future has to be driven by people, and it has to be driven by their hearts, and they have to want to get involved. They have to want to love their neighbor, and if have to want to do things that are going to make a difference in the lives of other Canadians. And I think there are still so many great people in Canada like that we just can't fail. That's my conviction.
So I'm going to hit you with a somewhat of a psychological question. You have answered this, but I look at Alberta and I look at BC, which is the province I'm in. You speak of God. It's like God took Texas and put it next to California. Like you have the most conservative province next to what I consider to be the most left wing province. What is it about you guys that makes you yearn for freedom, for liberty, for individuality, and then ours, where we're racing towards what I call communism?
Well, with all due respect, I think you are being unfair to your province. I know a little bit about this because I have a friend in Victoria who's a lawyer, and he organizes something called the We Unify Conference that I had the pleasure of attending in Victoria last year. And there's going to be another event actually coming up, if I can put in a shameless plug here. Anyone can attend it, but Dave Rubin is going to be one of the hosts. I understand Ben Shapiro is coming, people like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. I'm going to be there if that's of interest. And actually, there is a very strong and growing conservative movement in British Columbia. A lot of people, it didn't get much publicity, but I understand that the largest sympathetic public protest during the Freedom Convoy outside of Ottawa actually took place, I believe it was in Victoria. And we don't hear about this, but actually there's a very strong populist movement, a growing populist movement in British Columbia. I think part of the problem that you're experiencing in British Columbia is you have those two parties that are kind of splitting the right, if you will. And this is a problem that we had in Alberta about 10, 12 years ago, and that started the Unite the Right movement. I think there are some incredibly gifted people in British Columbia who are supporting the conservative movement. And there are some people in BC. I think there's a lot of hope for British Columbia. Unfortunately, right now, they're not in power, and that's difficult. That's challenging. But I really see British Columbia, the conservative movement in British Columbia, on the rise. And I would not be at all surprised if in the next election, one of those parties, or perhaps a combination of them, an amalgamation of them, could take power there. So I don't think there's a loss of hope. The other thing that I know also is that Danielle Smith is working very closely with the quote-unquote small c conservative leaders in British Columbia to build a coalition. So I think I would say the way you frame your question is, strictly speaking, it's correct. But the reality is there's a heck of a lot of liberals in Alberta, and there's just as many conservatives in British Columbia. So what I would hope to do is try and help those people working for towards freedom and prosperity and human flourishing in the province of British Columbia. I would hope I want to help work with them and to build that movement there, because I think the good people of British Columbia really want that. Especially, I mean, a lot of the communities that I've been to, especially in this central and northern part of the province, maybe not so much out on the coast. That seems to be the nexus or the focal point of the leftist movement out there, and unfortunately they exercise a lot of control in that province. Just because you know this better than I do, just because of the population density. But I would say if you took a fuller cross section of British Columbia, I think that the conservative people are more geographically dispersed in that province than people would think. So I think there's a lot of hope for British Columbia, and I know that many Albertans are quite interested and indeed motivated to make a change there. That's part of the reason why I'm going to We Unify. And I think it's great that it's in Victoria, because you have all these people come there and it's happening right in their backyard. It must really irritate people like Mr. Singh.
Here's a question. I look at a lot of the problems that we have in Canada, and I feel like if we just took a property rights approach, those problems would evaporate. So with SOGI, if we had local schools, private schools, charter schools, you could just if you support SOGI, you take your kid to that school. If you don't, you take them to a different school. But we have public education that's been captured. Same thing with municipal land planning in BC. They're trying to centralize that, rather like they're taking rights away from property owners.
Yeah.
Am I completely wrong? Like, is the future that we need more and more laws? Like every time a problem presents, you just create another law and another law, or do we have to refine and simplify?
I think that I think we need less law. I think the history of property rights in Canada has been distorted by the Supreme Court. In the aftermath of the Charter, if you actually read the Constitution Act of 1982, it specifically preserves all of the common law constitutional documents and history of the English common law, and makes it part of Canadian law. But unfortunately, in 1982, when we had this Trudeau renovation of our Constitution, judges and I talk a lot about judicial activism in my work and on my show, as you know, judges got the idea that somehow this was a singular document, the lens through which all Canadian law must be viewed. This is clearly wrong. And in fact, there's in the aftermath of the English Civil War, I'm just pulling it up right now, there was a document created called the English Bill of Rights. And in that English Bill of Rights, of course, if you remember your old English history, the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, in that British law, it specifically recognizes a couple of things. I'll just go from memory because I can't find it presently, but it recognizes personal property. So that document, that English civil rights, is as much a part of Canadian law as is the Magna Carta of 1215, which made Parliament supreme to the King, and which recognized essentially that's the rule of law. The rule of law being the concept that the law applies equally to everyone and that no one is above the law, a concept quite alien to the Trudeau Liberals. But the 1689 English Bill of Rights also and presaged what happened in America. People think that the Americans invented, the right to bear arms, to keep and bear arms. Actually, it's in the 1689 English Bill of Rights, and therefore a very cogent argument can be made. And I'm making this argument in Alberta right now, that the right to keep and bear arms is a part of Canadian constitutional law. It's part of our constitutional conventions. It's part of the common law history and tradition that we inherited from England. It's still part of our law. So we actually don't need to look to the Americans for this concept of a right to keep and bear arms. Well, why is that important to personal property? For this reason. If you look at the American Constitution and the constitutional documents there is not actually a formal recognition anywhere in there about protection of personal property. But the framers of the Constitution were very brilliant men, and they were very clever, and they knew what they were doing. Implicit in the right to keep and bear arms is the right to keep and hold personal property. Because what is a firearm? Well, a firearm is a species of personal property. And conversely, this is why I say to people who are indifferent about owning guns, I'm not a gun owner myself. I'm not a hunter. I don't shoot at anything. My weapons are words, which I understand now, according to the liberals, are violence. But be that as it may, the point is, I support gun ownership, and the reason why I support gun ownership is because I support personal property. And personal property is fundamental to maintenance of any free and democratic society. And so even if you don't like guns, you don't own a gun yourself. I would say to your viewers and listeners, you should support gun ownership, because if you don't support gun ownership, if we live in a country where guns can be confiscated, that means impliedly, that personal property can be seized. And legally speaking, there's no distinction between a gun and a television set, or your RSP, or your house for that matter. And so this is why in Canada the federal government is so intent upon confiscating guns, and this is why provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan are refusing to enforce that gun confiscation law. I wrote a paper previously for my book that was sort of a short history of gun regulation in the world, not only in Canada and throughout the world. And I found, to my horror, two things. Number one, gun confiscation is a hallmark. It is a signature move of totalitarian regimes. If you go through the USSR, Nazi Germany, Castro's Cuba, all of it, Maoist China.
Can I jump in? Catherine Austin Fitz, if you go on her website, she has a link to a Jewish website where they list every single time where there was a confiscation that led to a genocide.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the Jewish community are keenly aware of this. And so what's going on with gun confiscation in combination with the rise of anti-Semitism in the West are both very, very telltale signs that something is really, really wrong. And that's why I'm very concerned about anti-Semitism as well. I'm glad that you raised that point. But the other thing that I found out about the history of Canadian gun regulation, if we can call it that, is that none of it has ever worked. In fact, if it has worked at all, what has happened is gun regulation and confiscation has led to an increase in gun ownership. Because, of course, this is the natural reaction of people. If you try to take away something, what they'll do is they'll try to get more of it. At least that's the way Canadians react. And so we actually have more guns in our country right now than we ever have. And we really cannot prevent the flow of them into our country because we have the longest unguarded border in the world. And we happen to live next to the greatest producer of firearms and weapons in human history, and that's the United States. So this gun confiscation is never going to work, but people need to understand that there's a very close connection between human freedom, individual security, and personal property. And that those are always being attacked whenever you have a government which is trying to confiscate firearms. And I see the attempt to ban firearms and to confiscate them as a very clear signal that this government has no respect for personal property or the rights of the individual, and it must be resisted at all events.
I'm going to pick up on one thing you said. The whole common law principle and that judicial activism. Everybody is hyper focused on taking back our government, our legislature, and our executive, but no one's focusing on the courts. How do we fix the courts? How do we reform them and get the judges to do like Mosley, rule based on the law, not the government?
Yeah. Well, firstly, that Mosley decision just was like a shot of lightning out of the sky. I was so pleased to see that because just prior to that, the federal court had just put out its own regulations, which is illustrative of the problem you're talking about, saying that people like me would have to, every time I go in the federal court, I have to declare my gender pronouns. And I have to listen to, native land acknowledgements. And I am an Indigenous person, as you know, but I'm deeply offended by those. I think they're just the worst kind of virtue signaling. They're laughable. But why do I have to announce my gender pronouns? I have to announce my gender pronouns because the courts have been granted by law exclusive control over their internal process. Well, that's something that we can change. We can change it legislatively, and this is the answer to your question. What's happened in our country is we've had really an expansion, especially in the post-charter era, an expansion of what I call judicial discretion. And unfortunately, what has happened, what inevitably happens, Lord Acton has a great quotation. It's an aphorism that probably everyone who's listening to this has heard, and that is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This, for judges, this judicial discretion, it's a genie in a bottle, and the genie's out of the bottle. We have to get the genie back in the bottle. It is very tempting for anyone, including judges, to be given the opportunity to seize power, and judicial discretion gives them that. It gives them the power to make law. This is a power that they were never intended to have. These are non-elected intellectual elites. Most of them have lived pretty cloistered lives. They had very successful careers in the law, and then they entered the judiciary, which is a very sort of sequestered, cloistered world, the ivory tower, as it were, and they're really quite disconnected from the lives of everyday Canadians. And they are not elected. They are appointed for life. They're not answerable to the Canadian populace. And to make matters worse, because they've been through law school, and they've lived through and of course the law schools sadly are the incubus for all of these evil ideologies, from CRT to diversity, inclusion, equity to queer theory. All of it came out of law schools. I'm very sorry to say, and so they're steeped in this, and they lawyers as a whole, as a group of as a demographic group, are not like me. Most of them are very liberal. Some of them are progressive, and some of them are just full-blown Marxists. And this applies to judges too. Judges take who they are with them up to the bench, and this doesn't magically disappear when they put on those fancy red robes with the fur. They're just human beings, and what has happened in our country in the post-charter era is judges have been exercising more and more discretion, and they've waded into an area where they're making law, and they're actually telling our elected legislatures what to do. I'll give you really one and probably the best examples are the explosion of quote unquote rights that are not included in the charter. Think of indigenous rights. Think of trans rights. Think of things like gay marriage, LGBTQ, things of that nature. Those have not come out of legislation. Those are not in our charter. Those are rights that have been created by courts. And what is this? What is the solution here? I'll give you one other example that I think is really prescient. One of the only good things that Jason Kenney did is he opposed the imposition of the carbon tax when Trudeau brought it in several years ago, and a number of provinces challenged this. They went before the courts, and the Supreme Court of Canada, even though provinces have exclusive authority over natural resources under the Constitution Act, the courts told all of these provinces that that was trumped by the fact that the federal government has power over the environment. So what the court did is it expanded this sort of throwaway power that's in Section 91 of the environment, expanded that so that now the federal government was given a green light, pardon the pun, to regard every single Section 92 exclusive provincial power as being subject to the environment. And of course, this is why we have right now Mr. Guilbeault, our environmental minister, behaving like a maniac and telling Alberta and Saskatchewan that we're going to have to stop producing oil and gas. So the courts actually provided that license. So you see how important this is. The court's role properly is to interpret and apply the laws that legislatures make. It's the legislatures who are supreme in a properly functioning constitutional democracy like Canada, and that is because our elected officials are vested with the will of the people. We vote them in. and they're answerable to us. Sometimes we have to wait 4 years to get rid of them unless they form some kind of crazy coalition. But at least we have the chance to vote, so we have some say. We don't have any say over these judges, and if you look at the way they're being appointed, the National Post last summer actually produced a great series of articles which showed that about 80% of the judges who are being appointed in this country are actually liberal donors. Not just liberal supporters, but donors to the Liberal Party. One shocking example was one judicial candidate who for several years was consistently donating to the Conservative Party and then flipped and donated to the Liberal Party, and presto whammo, they're on the bench. So how do we change this? Well, we acknowledge that the legislatures are supreme, and it is the legislatures who can restrict and fetter judicial discretion, and they can do this legislatively. There are statutes on the books in Alberta, for example, something called the Interpretation Act, which tells judges how to interpret statute. We have something called the Judicature Act in Alberta, and there are federal equivalents, which give judges the power to control their own process. I spoke earlier about how judges, can impose, they can require lawyers to state their gender pronouns. During COVID, the courts independently went and actually were the most locked down places anywhere in the country, and they did that independently. Because they have that power under the Judicature Act. Well, legislatures can restrict that, and I think what we need to do is we need to renovate our Bill of Rights, and we need to look at these statutes that will restrict and fetter the discretion of judges so that they are no longer making law. Their job, as I said, is to interpret and apply law in a way that's consistent with the Constitution, and they have the only time that they should ever wade into sort of being a check on government is in situations like what Justice Mosley did, where it's clear that the government has exceeded their legal authority. They're guilty of government overreach, and the courts are there to say, look, you're not behaving in a way that's consistent with the Constitution. You're out of line here. And what happened in that case is the federal government actually they got into a room and they created a statute that gave them more power than any federal government has ever had in Canadian history, and they even exceeded that. That's how bad the Emergencies Act was and the way that they exercised it. And actually, that applies a concept in law called ultra vires, which means that they exceeded the limits, as I said, and it picked up on a doctrine that we actually applied in the Ingram case that I spoke of earlier. And that was why all of the lockdown orders were declared illegal in Alberta, was because again, the court said, look, you had this enormous power under the Public Health Act, you exceeded it, and so all these orders are declared illegal. But I think the short answer to your question is legislatures have to be courageous, they have to show conviction, and they have to limit the judicial discretion of judges, because that's what they're converting into this Promethean power to make law. And I don't think that judges should have any part in making law. It's just not their role.
This is a very comprehensive answer.
As you can tell, I put a lot of thought into this recently. It's a huge problem in our country. Huge. Really big.
Yeah, I was hoping to catch you off guard, and I had a whole bunch of follow-up questions, and you answered all of them. So.
Oh, wow, that's great. I'm glad I was able to do that.
Mr. Grey, we're getting to the end of the show. I know you have another meeting after this. So do you want to leave, not that you didn't do it throughout the whole episode, but do you want to leave the people with a message of hope or some advice on what to do?
Yes. What I'd say to them is, and of course, it's no secret. Anybody who knows me knows that, I'm guided by my Christian faith. And if you're not a Christian, that's okay. God loves you anyway. And I love you because you're my neighbor. In fact, when Tucker Carlson was here, he reminded everyone, he said, it really is remarkable that Christians are being persecuted because we're the only people who are commanded to pray for our enemies. So I'll just leave your viewers and listeners with this. God does not want you to try harder. He wants you to trust him deeper. So stop trying, start trusting, and this will change everything in you. And if you do that, you'll really notice things start to change in your own lives.
Mr. Leighton Grey, it's my understanding you're going to be on Jason Levine's show later today.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that too. I always enjoy talking with Jason. Really, the guy who knows the most about what's going on with the Coots 4. So every time I talk to him, I learn more about that situation. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to him.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't. I was going to ask you about that, but we didn't have time. So I just advise everybody to go
Happy
there
to,
and
happy to
watch.
come back and talk to you. I'm not the most authoritative source on that right now, although I'm being drawn into it. I'm more and more interested in what's going on there. And what I have said publicly is I think that the Minister of Justice, Mickey Amory, not the Premier, but the Minister of Justice needs to step in the exercise of proper prosecutorial discretion to really end what is a travesty of justice that's happening to those four men. That's the opinion I've expressed.
Well, for their sake, I hope they get out sooner rather than later. It's
Me too. I mean,
painful.
one of these poor guys just got 10 months for driving over a pylon. Just incredible. Meanwhile, you can get bail faster than you can say Coots 4, even though you invade the Edmonton City Hall with a rifle and a manifesto and an explosive device. You can get bail very, very quickly. Something is dreadfully wrong in our country with our justice system, without a doubt.
I say
We'll keep working on the building.
we're no longer living in the clown world. We've entered the deep clown space.
Well, call me Bozo then. Thanks for having me on your program. Really enjoyed
Thank
talking.
you very much. Thank you for coming on. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye.